It's working. Yes. Within the framework of DEBIDEM, a 5-year ERC-funded research project supervised by Yannis Papadioannakis at King's College London, I am preparing a critical edition for the Corpus Christianorum Series Graeca of the Quaestiones at Antiochum ducem. And if all goes well, fingers crossed, this edition will be finished by the end of next year, by the end of 2015, that is. The Quaestiones at Antiochum ducem is a so-called erotapocritic text, consisting of 137 questions and answers on a wide range of topics related to Christianity, such as, why does God not want us to know in advance when exactly we will die? Why did God appear unto Moses in a thorn bush? And does God prefer us to go to church or to give alms to the poor? New witnesses constantly appear, but as of today, the textual tradition counts 250 witnesses dating from the 10th to the 19th century. As you can tell from this chart, throughout the centuries, the absolute majority of these witnesses falsely attribute the Quaestiones at Antiochum ducem to Athanasius of Alexandria. At the beginning of the text, they read the following: "Of our Holy Father Athanasius, Archbishop of Alexandria, to the ruler Antiochus, concerning many and important questions which are raised in the Bible and which ought to be known by all Christians." When exactly the Quaestiones at Antiochum ducem was written is unclear. Some scholars date it as early as the first half of the 7th century, while others, referring to the many questions on the veneration of icons, date it to the turbulent 8th century. For example, question 39 asks, why do we venerate the holy icons and the cross? Is that not idolatry? And question 41 asks, why do we Christians make copies of the cross, but not of the holy lance, the reed, or the sponge? The Quaestiones at Antiochum ducem was first edited in 1600 by Velkman, who based his edition on a small number of witnesses, some of which are still not identified today. In his edition, Velkman included a Latin translation made in 1556 by Peter Nannius, a humanist from Leuven. In 1698, de Montfaucon revised Velkman's edition, and in 1777, this revision was republished by Giustiniani, and it was this text which in 1887 was included in the Patrologia Graeca. The order of the questions as found in the Patrologia Graeca, as well as their numbering, seems to be correct. As I will illustrate further onwards, this numbering is probably a very old, if not an original feature of the text. I am a bit reluctant to remove any of the questions found in the Patrologia Graeca, but it contains many quotations from and references to the Church Fathers, which clearly are later interpolations and therefore need to go. At the end of question 1, for example, discussing the Holy Trinity, a group of closely related witnesses adds a quotation from Gregory of Nazianzus in Sanctum Baptisma. Another group of witnesses does not quote the text of Gregory, but simply adds that you have to read Gregory the theologian should you desire to know more. Note that most of these interpolations are to be found in the first half of the text. As for the wording of the text, the edition in the Patrologia Graeca relies heavily on a 14th century witness now kept in Basel. It relies on this witness too heavily, I think, although of course I cannot be certain as long as there is no stemma. As always, very few readings are clear errors. In most cases, all of the readings found in the witnesses make sense, and only the stemma can unmask the errors. Still, at this point, I suspect the following readings of the Patrologia Graeca to be errors. In question 12, Theatinos Agiou Angelou should be put before and not after Theos. In question 16, Atheoritos and Skedonomiatis ton Angelon Leptotitos should be added as extra characteristics of the human soul, whereas in question 20, the structure of a whole sentence should be changed from tin gerantaf ton echusin et ton angium psyche kiestin afti merikia polapsis to afti gera in echusid nin et ton angium psyche merikia polapsis esti. More importantly, perhaps, in question 38, the Patrologia Graeca has added unjustly ite Iudei, ite Hellenes, after ite pisti, ite apisti. Small as they may be, these errors have led to a gross misunderstanding, for example, of the Church Slavonic tradition of the Quaestiones at Antiochum ducem, as I will demonstrate further onwards. Yes, that's right, the Church Slavonic tradition. Originally written in Greek, the Quaestiones at Antiochum ducem was translated into Church Slavonic. It was also translated into Arabic, Armenian, Ethiopic, Georgian, and Latin. As far as I know, there are only 2 bilingual witnesses, however, preserving Greek original and translation side by side, one of which is this 16th or 17th century witness now kept at the Spanish National Library in Madrid and preserving, as you can see, next to the Greek text, a Latin translation. Although further research is needed, it is clear that this is not a translation made in 1556 by Peter Nannius, which, as said, Velkman in 1600 included in his edition. The second bilingual witness I know of is this 18th century witness now kept in Copenhagen, which has preserved next to the Greek text a Church Slavonic translation. A partial Church Slavonic translation, actually. As you can see, whoever was responsible for this translation just gave up after question 6. No idea why. Again, further research is needed, but as for the Greek text preserved in this witness, it is highly likely that we are dealing here with a copy of an early printed edition of the Quaestiones at Antiochum ducem, perhaps of the very first one by Velkman. Unfortunately, I haven't managed yet to get hold of this edition, so I haven't been able yet to verify if this is indeed the case. Now, why do I think we are dealing here with a copy of an early printed edition? Well, for example, these brackets here are a bit odd. I've never seen brackets being used in manuscripts before, but they're typical for old printed editions. And these exact same brackets, and in fact the exact same text, which is remarkably similar yet not identical to the one found in the Patrologia Graeca, we find in 2 other Greek witnesses from the 18th century. If all 3 of them indeed turn out to be related to an early printed edition, I can safely leave them out for my edition, which means taking into account not 250, but only 247 witnesses. Yay. As this map shows, witnesses of the Quaestiones at Antiochum ducem are to be found all over Europe and beyond. Now, I deliberately say witnesses instead of manuscripts, and I will explain why. As you can see, these 2 15th or 16th century manuscripts from the Florilegium library in Rome belong together. There is no mistaking that we are dealing here with one manuscript, which for some reason, at some point, was split in 2, right in the middle of question 45. In other words, we are dealing here with 2 different manuscripts, which together form one witness of the Quaestiones at Antiochum ducem. The opposite is true for this 16th century manuscript kept in Venice, which has preserved the Quaestiones at Antiochum ducem twice. On folia 240 to 245, we find a fairly large set of questions, but then on folia 360 verso to 365, we come across question 137, the very last question, asking how to convert the Jews to Christianity. As you can see, question 137 is presented as a completely independent text, written in a different hand, and it has its own title, Eroticis in Apocrisi Thavmasti, question with a wonderful answer. So in this case, we are dealing with one manuscript, but with 2 separate witnesses of the Quaestiones at Antiochum ducem. Interestingly, there are quite a few witnesses like this Venice manuscript, separating question 137 from the rest of the text. There are also quite a few witnesses preserving only question 137. It has therefore been argued that this question was added to the text at a later stage. Admittedly, it does differ a lot from the rest of the questions when it comes to style. It is much longer than the other questions, and it consists mainly of biblical quotations. And as you can see on this diagram, which visualizes the popularity of the questions, despite being at the very end of the text, question 137 was quite popular. You see how the line at the end suddenly goes up. Now, although there is definitely something fishy about this question, for safety's sake, I prefer not to exclude it from my critical edition just yet. It is highly likely, however, that this question initially was much shorter than it is now. As said, it asks how to convert the Jews to Christianity. More specifically, it asks how to convince the Jews that Christ has come, that Christ is God, and that Christ is real. Once these three questions have been addressed, we read the following. In order for us to fully condemn the Jewish obstinacy, and in order for us believers to become even more confident in our belief in Christ, come, let us now briefly list the testimonies from the Old Testament concerning the entire economy of Christ and the apology of the Gospels. What follows is a collection of biblical testimonia. It could well be that these testimonia were added to question 137 at a later stage, especially since they are not to be found in the Church Slavonic nor in the Arabic tradition. Although further research is needed, this would explain why question 137, unlike the other questions of the Quaestiones at Antiochum ducem, is full of biblical quotations and why it is so much longer. As for this striking drop just before the middle of the diagram, visualizing the popularity of the 137 questions the text consists of, this is question 49, asking how much time Adam spent in paradise. Interestingly, this question is missing in a lot of witnesses which have preserved the preceding and the following question, question 48 and question 50 that is, both of which deal with paradise too. Now, I am under the impression that not the absence, but the presence of the question is the error here. In other words, question 49 might well be a later addition, a marginal note perhaps, which accidentally ended up in the text. Now, it goes without saying that all traditions of the Quaestiones at Antiochum ducem are worth studying, especially the Arabic tradition, which predates the Greek one. This witness, now kept in Strasbourg, for example, was copied in the monastery of Mar Saba in 885, whereas, as said, our oldest Greek witnesses date from the 10th century. Barbara Rogema, a colleague of mine at King's, is preparing a critical edition of the Arabic material. Although I do not know any Arabic, and Barbara does not know any Greek, which inevitably complicates things. Luckily, she's from the Netherlands and I'm Flemish, so at least we can discuss things in Dutch. And it is a proper language, Dutch. We have been able to identify 6 Greek witnesses closely related to this Arabic Strasbourg witness, based, among other things, on a long addition to the very first question discussing the Holy Trinity, which all of them have in common. As you can see, these 6 Greek witnesses are quite recent, the oldest one dating from the 13th century. Had it not been for the Arabic Strasbourg witness, I would therefore unjustly have concluded that this addition to the text too is quite recent. Although we haven't managed yet to fit in the Arabic Strasbourg witness, this shows just how important it is to collaborate across disciplinary borders and to include as many translations as possible when preparing a critical edition of a given text, even if the text you're editing is the original, the source text, and not a translation itself. The opposite is also true, of course. You cannot edit a translation without thoroughly studying the original, the source text. As mentioned earlier, the many mistakes in the edition of the Patrologia Graeca, small as they may be, have led to a gross misunderstanding of the Church Slavonic tradition of the Quaestiones at Antiochum ducem. Together with a close friend of mine from the University of Oxford, Olga Grinchenka, I have studied the Church Slavonic tradition. By comparing a sample of Slavonic witnesses with all Greek witnesses which I have been able to study until now, 139 in total, we were able to prove that 2 independent Church Slavonic translations were in circulation. On the right-hand side, we have the oldest translation of the 2. It dates from 1076 at the latest, which is when this blue witness was copied. And it counts many different versions, as you can tell from all these different colors here, all of which preserve different sets of questions and sometimes rework the original quite heavily. On the left-hand side, we have the more recent translation, which is extremely literal. Nearly all witnesses of this translation have preserved the full text, and as for the language, it is actually Greek with Church Slavonic vocabulary instead of proper Church Slavonic. In all probability, it dates from the 14th century, when, as I have been told, many Greek texts were retranslated in this rather awkward manner. The only reason, however, why we, unlike others, spotted that we are dealing here with two independent Church Slavonic translations instead of one translation, which at some point was reworked, is that we had access to all these Greek witnesses. We did not have to content ourselves with the outdated edition of the Patrologia Graeca. The philological evidence is conclusive. These two translations do not have a single error in common and therefore cannot be related. The errors they do seem to have in common, and which others have referred to when claiming only one Church Slavonic translation was in circulation, are in fact errors of the edition found in the Patrologia Graeca. In question 2, for example, we are not dealing with an erroneous addition of praznik I in Church Slavonic, but with an erroneous omission of toner tonkie in the Patrologia Graeca. In question 4, on the other hand, we are not dealing with an erroneous omission of tonanthroponkie malista in Church Slavonic, but with an erroneous addition in the Patrologia Graeca. Hopefully, this justifies why I am spending 5 years on preparing a new edition of the Quaestiones at Antiochum ducem. But how exactly am I planning to do this? How on earth am I going to edit a text preserved in 250 witnesses? I must admit that when I first found out just how much material I'm expected to process, I was a bit overwhelmed. I still am, completely overwhelmed. It soon became clear that collating the text from beginning to end in all 250 Greek witnesses is not an option. I did try, but after 26 witnesses, I had to throw in the towel. Collating the full text in all witnesses would take me 10 years, I calculated. Collating a selection of questions in all witnesses then. Unfortunately, this did not work either. Well, why not? Well, there is not a single question which is preserved in all 250 witnesses, and thus would allow me to compare all of these witnesses. I did try to come up with a reasonable selection of questions which would allow me to do so, but it turned out to be impossible. So I decided to take some distance and try to gain a clear view of the situation. I created a simple database storing all possible sorts of information about the witnesses in which the Quaestiones at Antiochum ducem has come down to us. All this data, you would think, should allow me to make an educated guess about which witnesses are highly likely to be related to one another. Witnesses, for example, skipping the exact same questions, witnesses disturbing the order of the questions in the exact same way, or witnesses adding to the text the exact same quotations from or references to the Church Fathers. Instead of collating witnesses at random, you would think I should be able to collate a small sample of questions in these few witnesses, which are likely to be related only, and immediately arrange them into a small stemma. All these small stemmata I should then be able to merge into one big, gigantic, huge megastemma. Alas, when it comes to contents, we are dealing with an extremely heterogeneous tradition. Nearly all witnesses have preserved a unique set of questions. So this approach worked only in a small number of cases, as I will demonstrate now. As you can tell from these two graphs, the 11th century Parisinis Coislinianus 109 and the Arthoslav Raiota 120, which was copied in 1600, both of them have transposed question 39 and question 40, explaining why Christians worship the cross, after question 42, which lists the reason why the Christian faith is so much better than any other faith. Perhaps I should first explain how these two funky graphs work. They show us exactly which questions have been preserved in these two witnesses and in which order. So the straight line here shows that for the first third of the text, the first witness has preserved all of the questions in the correct order. These three horizontal lines here show that the second witness, at 3 separate points in the text, has skipped some questions. These funny things here show that there has been a transposition in both witnesses. As said, these two witnesses have transposed question 39 and question 40 after question 42. And finally, this big horizontal line here shows that the first witness, at the very end of the text, has gone back to a question which it had left out earlier. Now, this question is question 49, which, as said, is missing in a great many witnesses, and which could well be a marginal note which accidentally ended up in the body of the text. After collating a couple of questions It was obvious that the witness from the Great Lavra monastery was copied from the one which is now to be found in Paris, yet was originally kept at the Great Lavra monastery. This means that when it comes to the reconstruction of the text, this witness can be safely left out. I then noticed that the Paris witness and its copy add quite a lot of extra material to the text, as is the case, for example, at the end of question 38, which asks why Christian boys are not circumcised like Christ was. These same additions we find in 3 other witnesses. A witness dating from 1359, now kept at the Bodleian Library in Oxford, a witness from the second half of the 15th century, now kept in Vienna, and the aforementioned 14th century witness from Basel, which highly influenced the edition found in the Patrologia Graeca. Based on a collation of, again, just a couple of questions, this is how I think all these witnesses are related to one another. Now, in order to build up this small stemma, I used good old error-based stemmatics, which, as you probably all know, presupposes that 2 witnesses sharing a number of errors must somehow be related to one another. If apart from this set of shared errors, only one of these 2 witnesses has some errors of its own, it must be a copy of the other one. If both have some errors of their own, they must be copied from a common ancestor that did not survive the ravages of time. As you can see, I managed to draw up a little stemma for 30 more witnesses. But then I got stuck. As I said, we are dealing here not only with an extremely abundant tradition, but also with an extremely heterogeneous tradition, at least when it comes to contents. Nearly all witnesses have preserved a unique set of questions. This makes it virtually impossible to group them according to their contents. To complicate things even further, regarding the wording of the text, we are dealing with an extremely stable and homogeneous tradition, and there aren't that many, or at least not that many, spectacular differences between the witnesses. So I am not saying that traditional error-based stemmatics is useless, absolutely not. It is a combination of these 3 factors: an overwhelming number of witnesses, too much variation when it comes to contents, and too little when it comes to the wording of the text, which makes it hard not to lose track of the situation. Therefore, I see no other option but to try and distill out of this big and diverse group of witnesses a smaller, less diverse group. Only then is partial collation truly an option, and partial collation is all I have time for. As I said at the beginning of my talk, this edition needs to be finished by the end of 2015. So I need to be realistic. I don't have much time left, and although I'm getting some help from my colleague Peter Toth with the collation, it's basically just me who is preparing this edition. Also, I hope that you agree with me that it is better to spend 5 years preparing a solid, reliable edition than it is to spend 50 years on the perfect edition and leave out in the cold, even hostage, other scholars who might be waiting for your edition, whose work might benefit from your edition. As I've demonstrated earlier, the edition found in the Patrologia Graeca, which is the only edition out there, is not reliable. As a result, scholars have reached wrong conclusions, for example, regarding the Church Slavonic tradition of the Quaestiones at Antiochum ducem. As said, 2 independent translations were in circulation. Some scholars, however, have argued that these 2 translations are related to one another. More specifically, they have argued that these translations are the strict translation, which Olga Grinchenka, and I think is in fact a more recent one, lay at the basis of the freer and more diverse translation. And you can't blame them. When the edition of the Patrologia Graeca is all you have to compare the Church Slavonic witnesses with, this conclusion makes sense. I'm sure you didn't need convincing, but this once more shows the importance of a good edition. Now, how will I decide which witnesses are worth doing a partial collation of and which not? I think it is very important to objectivize the decision which witnesses to keep and which not, yet at the same time, I do not want this to be an arbitrary decision. I still want to have some scholarly input. So I refuse, for example, to disregard the 100 most recent copies or to take into account only those witnesses which have preserved, for example, let's say, at least 75% of the text. So what I suggest doing is to weigh my witnesses based on a number of parameters and then order them from most to least likely to be a faithful witness. Now, this is all about eliminating noise. eliminating unfaithful witnesses without actually having to collate them. So I am not saying that such witnesses are not interesting. On the contrary, witnesses preserving a unique version of the Quaestiones et Antiochum ducem are fascinating, and they deserve to be studied. They can tell us a lot about the reception, about the Nachleben of this text. Yet when it comes to the critical edition, they are useless. So what will these parameters be? So far I have come up with 7. I would like to stress that all comments, all suggestions are welcome. If anyone does not agree with my parameters, or if anyone can think of some additional parameters, great, please say so. That's why I'm here today, to get some feedback from you. Let us begin with Florilegia and short quotations of the Quaestiones et Antiochum ducem in other texts, which make up around 1/3 of all witnesses. This is easy. I will have no mercy with such witnesses. They have to go. Even though I acknowledge their value for our understanding of the reception of this text, these witnesses often have a tradition of their own, which would mean even more material to deal with, and I'm struggling already. Also, strictly speaking, these witnesses belong to the indirect tradition of the text. So honestly, I don't think any philologist will give me a dirty look because I decided not to include them. There are no gaps in the direct tradition of the Quaestiones et Antiochum ducem, so there is really no reason why we need to involve the indirect tradition. These witnesses are also often less reliable, which makes sense, of course. In order to fit in with the other excerpts, our text in Florilegia is often quite fundamentally altered. This is the case, for example, with question 80, asking why some people find it difficult to cry, which was included in the Florilegium Coislinianum, a 10th century Florilegium preserved inter alia in a 14th century manuscript kept at the National Library here in Athens. The Florilegium Coislinianum is an alphabetically ordered Florilegium. So question 80, which deals with tears or dacria, is to be found in Book Delta. 3 consecutive chapters of Book Delta are devoted to tears. Chapter 7, which is entitled Perisacrion Physiologia, consists of 2 different excerpts, one from Cosmas Vestitor and one from Gregory of Nyssa's De Opificio Hominis. The next chapter, chapter 8, is entitled Etiperisakrion and consists of 1 long anonymous excerpt unjustly attributed to John Chrysostom. The last chapter devoted to tears is chapter 9, which is entitled Perisiaphorastacrion. It consists of 2 different excerpts, namely question 80 from the Quaestiones et Antiochum ducem, immediately followed by an excerpt from John Climacus Scala Paradisi. Now, question 80 has been deliberately altered in order to fit in with the other excerpts. For example, the question was turned into a statement. How come that some cry for the least little thing while others seem unable to cry has become some cry for the least little thing while others seem unable to cry? Now, why do I think this was done deliberately? Well, firstly, none of the 139 Greek witnesses of the Quaestiones et Antiochum ducem, which I have been able to study until now, have preserved a statement instead of a question. Secondly, unlike the Quaestiones et Antiochum ducem, the Florilegium Coislinianum is not an erotapocritic text. It is not a collection of questions and answers, so it shouldn't surprise us that the question has been turned into a statement. It makes perfect sense that this was done. Another example of question 80 being deliberately altered is the insertion of a short introduction just before what used to be the answer to the question. It is necessary to explain the solution to this as follows. Again, this short introduction is not to be found in any of the 139 Greek witnesses of the text which I've been able to study until now. Some of the smaller variants to be found in the Florilegium Coislinianum are attested, though, in the direct tradition of the Quaestiones et Antiochum ducem, and with a bit of luck, these smaller variants will lead me to the witness which was used for the assembly of the Florilegium Coislinianum. Now, interesting as the Florilegium Coislinianum or other Florilegia preserving bits and pieces of the Quaestiones et Antiochum ducem may be, they do cause noise, and noise is exactly what I'm trying to eliminate. As said, I am not studying the reception of the Quaestiones et Antiochum ducem. I am preparing a critical edition of the text. Let's move on to our second parameter, the age of the witnesses. The older a witness, the higher up my list it should be, I think. I know recentiores non deterioris. But again, there are no gaps in the transmission of the Quaestiones at Antiochum ducem, so let's face it. What are the odds that an 18th century witness is a direct copy of a now lost 9th century witness? The reality is that many of the most recent copies contain so many unique variants that they threaten to smother the older variants. All they do is cause noise. Again, I'm not saying that these more recent witnesses are not worth studying. They are of immense value when it comes to the study of the reception of the Quaestiones at Antiochum ducem, but that's not what I'm doing. It would, for example, be pointless to base my edition on this 18th century witness kept at the Municipal Library of Zahora. The language used here is very different from what we find in the other witnesses. Although I am not an expert, we seem to be dealing here with a sort of early modern Greek version of the text, which is pretty cool, I think. The genitivus absolutus, for example, at the beginning of answer 124, to Christou legondos, is replaced by the much simpler but also much more modern construction O Kyrios ke Theos ke patirimonie sus Christos legi. In the conditional clause that follows, the constituent order is changed from subject-object-verb to subject-verb-object, the predominant constituent order in modern Greek. Io satanas ton satanan ekvali becomes ian satanas ekvali ton satana. The negation is replaced twice by then, and the annoying me verb istate is replaced by stekete. The construction noun plus article plus participle is replaced by the construction noun plus relative clause. Othemonoikon becomes othemonopeine. Note that ina is used as third person singular instead of st. The construction pros plus substantivized infinitive is replaced by diana plus subjunctive. Prosta paticine tus anthropus becomes diana patici kiena planesi tus anthropus. And finally, the substantivized infinitive is replaced by substantivized subjunctive. Antitu prostrigin prostheon becomes antituna kataphigiis ton theon. Our next parameter would be the presence or absence of the numbering system. As I mentioned earlier, the numbering of the question seems to be a very old, if not original feature of the text, and I will explain why. Firstly, in the Florilegium accompanying his third sermon on the images, John of Damascus quotes question 39, which discusses the veneration of icons. The same question we also find in the Doctrina Patrum. What is more, both texts explicitly refer to this question as the 38th question from a collection of 100 questions by Athanasius of Alexandria addressed to a certain Antiochus. Both these texts predate the direct tradition of the Quaestiones at Antiochum ducem. As said, the oldest surviving witnesses date from the 10th century. Even though, as you can see on this chart, only a third of all Greek witnesses which have come down to us numbered their questions, this irrefutably proves that the numbering system as found in the Florilegium accompanying John of Damascus' third sermon on the images and the Doctrina Patrum is indeed a very old feature of the text. The fact that they refer to question 39 as question 38 doesn't necessarily mean that a question was added to the text later on. It might well be the case that the witness which led to these two quotations was simply missing one of the preceding questions or had merged two questions, which is not uncommon at all. Nor does the fact that the Quaestiones at Antiochum ducem is referred to as a collection of 100 instead of 137 questions mean that 37 questions were added to the text at a later stage. This quotation may well have been drawn from a witness accidentally containing only 100 questions. Secondly, the same numbering system is to be found in the oldest witness we know of. This Arabic witness, which, as I said earlier, is to be found in Strasbourg and was copied in 885 in the monastery of Mar Saba. In my experience, witnesses not retaining this old numbering system are less likely to be faithful witnesses, which is why I want them to come lower on my list than witnesses which do number the questions. The same goes for witnesses preserving only a small selection of questions, witnesses not respecting the order of the questions at all, and witnesses not attributing the text to Athanasius, parameters 4, 5, and 6. This makes sense, I guess. Does it really surprise us that a scribe who is audacious enough to leave out half of the questions feels free to alter the wording of the text, to abridge questions, or to add on them? Remember this 18th century Zachora witness. Not only has it drastically updated the language of the Quaestiones at Antiochum ducem, it also has some extensive additions to the text which are not to be found in any other witness, and it has preserved but 7 questions. As for these witnesses preserving only a handful of questions, there is, of course, also the practical consideration, I'll admit it, that I need to make the group of witnesses more homogeneous in terms of contents. Otherwise, it is impossible to do a partial collation, which, as I pointed out, is all I have time for. Our 7th and last parameter, then, copies of witnesses we still dispose of today. I'm sure you agree with me that it doesn't make sense to include such witnesses in my collation. The Athos Lavraiota 120, for example, which was copied in 1600, probably directly from the 11th century Parisiensis Coislinianus 109, originally copied at the Great Lavra Monastery too, can be safely left out. The same goes for those witnesses which were copied from early printed editions, which I've mentioned earlier. Okay. So this is the list of witnesses automatically generated by my database based on the 7 parameters discussed just now, ordered from most to least likely to be useful for the critical edition of the Quaestiones at Antiochum ducem. The witnesses on top, thus, are those witnesses which are old, which have preserved many questions, which have respected the order of the questions, and so on. Of course, this list is not the definitive one. As said, the Greek tradition of the Quaestiones at Antiochum ducem counts 250 witnesses. At the moment, I have photographs of 200 of them. So I'm still looking for photographs of 50 more witnesses, some of which are quite old and thus could be of great importance. So if anyone here has good connections with the monastery of St. John the Theologian on Patmos, you never know, I would very much appreciate it if you could help me to get hold of photographs of manuscripts 17 and 112 in their collection, both of which supposedly date from the 10th century. In theory, the next step would be to calculate the smallest possible representative set of questions on the collation of which I could base my stemma. In order to do so, I would run the so-called greedy set algorithm. Okay, I'll admit it, I would ask my husband, who happens to be a computer scientist, to run the greedy set algorithm for me and calculate the minimal set of questions I need to collate in order for all of my selected witnesses to be represented. In practice, however, I have already collated 14 questions in order to link the Church Slavonic tradition to the Greek one. As said, the Church Slavonic tradition counts 2 independent translations, the oldest of which dates from 1076 at the latest, which is when this blue witness here was copied. Now, this blue witness is a very interesting one. It's a so-called zbornik, some sort of Sammelhandschrift, preserving but 14 questions from the Quaestiones at Antiochum ducem, jumbled up completely, as you can tell from this graph, and mixed with other questions, for example, from the Quaestiones et Responsiones by Anastasius of Sinai. Scholars have been arguing for decades whether this selection of questions was copied directly from a Greek model preserving only these questions, or instead from a Church Slavonic model preserving the full text of the Quaestiones at Antiochum ducem. Based on this stemma, it is now quite safe to assume that the latter is what happened. Most of the other witnesses in this group have preserved a full translation of our text, which means that the compilation of questions as found in the zbornik is a Slavonic piece of work and not a Byzantine. Now, in order to link these 2 Church Slavonic translations to the Greek tradition, I collated the 14 questions preserved in our oldest Church Slavonic witness in the zbornik in all Greek witnesses currently at my disposal. As I said earlier, at the moment I have photographs of 200 Greek witnesses, 139 of which have preserved at least one of the questions found in the zbornik. The partial collation of these 139 witnesses showed that the strict Church Slavonic translation is closely related to this 16th century Greek witness, now to be found at the Bodleian Library in Oxford, carrying here siglum M97. As you can tell from this graph, this Oxford witness has skipped and transposed a number of questions. As you can see, 4 Slavonic witnesses belonging to the strict translation have preserved the exact same set of questions in the exact same order as this Greek Oxford witness. Admittedly, the position of the oldest witness of this strict translation, a 14th century witness now kept in Prague, is somewhat problematic. Firstly, it has preserved a substantial number of questions which are missing in our Greek Oxford witness and the other witnesses of this translation. Secondly, an overwhelming number of errors shared by the Greek Oxford witness on the one hand and these other Church Slavonic witnesses on the other are not to be found in this Prague witness. For example, the substantial omission at the very end of question 77. These inconsistencies can only be explained for by assuming that we are dealing here with a contaminated witness, in the sense that the copyist of this Prague witness corrected his main model by means of a second model. Unfortunately, I haven't succeeded yet in linking the other, less literal and probably older translation to a Greek witness. Now, don't you agree with me that it would be a pity not to use the collation of this particular set of questions for the stemma of the Greek tradition an sich? As I said, however, when it comes to contents, the tradition of the Quaestiones at Antiochum ducem is annoyingly heterogeneous, and not a single question has been preserved in all Greek witnesses. More specifically, out of the 200 Greek witnesses I have photographs of, 61 are not presented in this partial collation, which is just over 30%. This is absolutely horrible. Something needs to be done about this. Or not. Is it really that problematic that I left out just over 30% of my witnesses? Because the witnesses I left out actually are those which either come at the bottom of my list or which are not to be found at the list at all because they are, for example, Florilegia, which I decided not to take into account for this edition. So I guess we're good. Admittedly, I should have come up with all of this at the start of this project 3 years ago. In an ideal world, photographs of all 250 witnesses would have arrived 1 month after ordering them. I would then have studied all of these witnesses at once. That is, checked which questions they have preserved and in which order, whether they have numbered their questions, and so on. I would then have listed these witnesses from most to least likely to be useful for the edition, based on the 7 parameters which I discussed just now. And only then would I have decided which questions to collate in order to compare all of these witnesses and organize them in a stemma. Unfortunately, this is not how it went. I guess this is not an ideal world. And I made some mistakes. Not asking my fabulous husband, for example, for help, not asking him to calculate this minimal set of questions before actually starting the partial collation was a mistake, because it would have meant less questions to collate and thus less work. But that too is what I'm here for today, to confide to you my mistakes so that perhaps you can all learn from them. On the other hand, I don't think I could have come up with these 7 parameters without thoroughly studying all these witnesses. I would never have guessed, for example, that witnesses not numbering their questions are often less reliable. Anyway, the 14 questions I decided to collate luckily come from all over the text, which should enable me to recognize contaminated witnesses, or at least those witnesses which are contaminated in the sense that one part of it relies on one model and another part on another, which is what happened with this 16th century witness from the Dogiaria monastery in Mount Athos. Recently, my colleague Peter Toth and I took an interest in questions dealing with the veneration of icons, so we decided to collate also question 39, which, as said earlier, is quoted in the Florilegium accompanying the 3rd sermon of John of Damascus on the images, and in the Doctrina Patrum. Although further research is needed, we are pretty confident that we will be able to link a Greek witness from the direct tradition of the Quaestiones at Antiochum ducem to these quotations, which are very similar, by the way, and must be somehow related. Apart from question 39, we also decided to collate question 41, which deals with the veneration of these icons too. Now that this partial collation is finally done, the next step is to build up the stemma, which eventually will help me to decide which witnesses I need to base my edition on and thus need to be collated from beginning to end. In order to build up the stemma and reconstruct the relationships between all these witnesses, I plan to use both traditional error-based stemmatics, as I did before, and phylogenetics. I won't go into much detail, but still some background information on phylogenetics could be useful. Phylogenetics is an umbrella term used for several different yet complementary computational methods used by evolutionary biologists to reconstruct the relationships between species. Philologists, including myself, have been successfully applying phylogenetic methods to textual traditions for about 20 years. I'm sure you have all heard of the Canterbury Tales paper published in 1998 in Nature. I have nothing to do with this paper, unfortunately. So there is no need for me to prove that these methods work. They do. There are several reasons, however, why they haven't been generally adopted yet. First of all, I'll admit it, there are no clear guidelines. We all just muddle on. Secondly, although the computer programs used in phylogenetics are rather self-explanatory, you need to find yourself a friendly expert willing to help you to decide exactly which phylogenetic method is most suitable for your data, as well as to interpret the results, to interpret all these exotic phylogenetic trees these programs spit out. Thirdly, applying phylogenetics to a textual tradition requires quite a bit of preparatory work. You need to transform your collation, which in my case looks like this, a pretty straightforward yet huge Excel file, within the first column, the text of the Patrologia Graeca, which I chose as a reference text, and then in the next columns, all 139 witnesses which have been collated. It's important to point out that this is a collation and not a transcription. So an empty cell means that at that specific point, the witness follows the reference text, in this case, the Patrologia Graeca. I chose to do a collation rather than a transcription simply because it saves you a bit of time. But that is just my personal opinion, of course. And I must admit that when you actually want to compare your witnesses, a full transcription is more user-friendly. So this time, I did not hesitate. I asked my husband for help, and he wrote me a simple computer program which turned my collation automatically into a transcription, which looks like this. Of course, a phylogenetic program cannot handle this kind of data. You need to transform it again, this time into a computer-readable matrix, which I did manually, for one of the questions, namely question 14. And here you see the result. So in the first column, you have a list of variables, and then per witness, you have one column stating which of these variables it has. Preparing this matrix took quite some time, but then it is quite detailed. As you can see here, one of the variables is whether the witnesses have simply pneumatophori or pneumatophori plus something else. And then on the next line, you can see that the something else can be either Andres or Pateres. And then again on the next line, you see that in the case of Andres, there are 3 different ways in which this Andres is combined with pneumatophori. As I said, preparing this matrix is time-consuming and it gives you a headache. So I asked my husband to come up with a solution, and he wrote me a program which transforms this, my collation, into this, a proper matrix, a string of variables per witness, which then, after some minor tweaking, can be fed into the phylogenetic program. Creating this matrix automatically is a matter of seconds rather than weeks or even months. So you can spend much more time collating witnesses, much more time working with manuscripts, which is much more fun, of course. Also, it is very easy to add new witnesses. You just rerun the program. Whereas when you are making this matrix manually and you want to add a new witness, basically you have to start all over again. It is admittedly slightly less detailed than the matrix I made manually because it won't recognize this sort of nested variables. I am slightly worried about this, but I'm hoping that it won't have too much effect on the analysis, but it's definitely something I need to look into. Also, while you are collating, you need to make sure that you always encode the same variant in the same way and that everything stays neatly aligned, which can be a bit tricky when dealing with a huge spreadsheet like this. Perhaps I could show you examples, an example of a phylogenetic tree. On the left, you see a classic stemma. On the right, you see a phylogenetic tree. They both visualize the tradition of the Florilegium Coislinianum, the 10th century alphabetically ordered Florilegium, which I have mentioned earlier. The stemma was drawn up using traditional error-based stemmatics. The phylogenetic tree was drawn up by Caroline Massé and Koen Geuten. He's a friendly expert, a friendly biologist, both from the University of Leuven and myself, using Mr. Bayes, a widely used phylogenetic computer program which you can freely download. As you can see, in a traditional stemma, the length of the branches visualizes the distance between the witnesses in time, the witnesses at the bottom being the most recent ones. In the phylogenetic tree, however, the length of the branches visualizes the distance between the witnesses regarding the wording of the text, which I personally think is much more informative. Witnesses E and G, for example, were both copied in the 13th century and therefore on the same height in the stemma. In the phylogenetic tree, however, E is on a much shorter branch than G, indicating that it has preserved a better text. The same goes for witnesses A and T. Although A is slightly younger than T, it has preserved a better text. As I said, however, I can't do the phylogenetic analysis of the abundant tradition of the Quaestiones at Antiochum ducem on my own. I need help from an expert, and I'm really hoping that we will find one soon. I did make some trees myself using Mesquite and Mr. Bayes, both of which you can freely download, and I was very pleased when I recognized some of the small stemmata I had drawn up using traditional error-based stemmatics. The pink group of witnesses here, for example, is exactly the same as this handmade stemma. The yellow group is exactly the same as this handmade stemma, so it works. Although I'm not surprised that it works, I knew it would work, of course. Anyway, once I have reconstructed the relationships between my witnesses, I can start working on the actual edition. Finally! This means that based on the stemma, I will have to select the best witnesses and collate all remaining questions in them. As I said, this edition will be published in the Corpus Christianorum series Graeca, so it will be a printed edition. I truly hope, however, that this printed edition will be the starting point of something much bigger and perhaps much more exciting. I truly hope that somehow, somewhere, sometime, there will be a follow-up project. Because what I would really like to do is to go digital. What exactly this would mean, I'm not entirely sure yet, and I would need help, of course. But I would like to put online all the information I have on these witnesses, all my collations, and my entire database, or at least a streamlined version of it, because it's a bit messy right now, so that it can grow, and maybe one day we will be able to map out the entire tradition of the Quaestiones at Antiochum ducem, including those witnesses which, sadly enough, I just cannot take into account right now. The Florilegia, the excerpts, the modern versions, the crazy versions, and of course the translations. Wouldn't that be great? The abundant and steady tradition of the Quaestiones at Antiochum ducem, consisting of 250 Greek witnesses dating from the 10th all the way up till the 19th century, and the translations into Arabic, Armenian, Church Slavonic, Ethiopic, Georgian, and Latin, all of this shows just how important this text was. So it deserves only the best. Because there is no reliable edition, however, scholars have been steering clear of it, and the Quaestiones at Antiochum ducem today is scandalously understudied. My edition, hopefully, will change this. Thank you.